video is called What Else is Reaped? It's really a follow-on video to an earlier video about where is the rapture in Revelation. And what we didn't really see there, because I was skipping past the verses in that previous video, is where we found where rapture was described, and it's described as a reaping of grain, and that makes sense, and we discussed that. But I skipped the verses that talked about something else being reaped, and it fits right in with those verses, but I left those out so I could break it into a separate topic here. And so what's being reaped, or what else is being reaped in addition to grain, is grapes. And these are the storied grapes of wrath. If you remember the Battle Hymn of the Republic, things like that talk about grapes of wrath, and these are those grapes. And so the Battle Hymn of the Republic, if you don't know it, old hymn, goes something like, I have seen the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. And so that's the grapes of wrath we're talking about being reaped here. And so the question that we have in this video to answer is, who do they represent? Can we put this grapes of wrath into some sort of context that will help us unravel the symbolism that's being used? So this reaping of the grapes, why grapes is kind of the question, and we'll get into that. So we see it in Revelation 14, 17 through 18, and it says, and another angel went out from the temple which is in heaven, and there was with him a sharp sickle. Now, if you remember the previous video, there was also another sickle that reaped earth and reaped the harvest from the earth. So this is another angel and another sharp sickle. And it says, another angel went out from the altar who had authority over fire. Now, fire is important here. And he shouted with a great voice to him who had the sharp sickle with him, send your sharp sickle and gather of the clusters of the vineyards of earth, because its grapes are large. Okay, so what we see here is another reaping, very similar to the one we saw of the reaping of the harvest. But the difference here is that there are clusters, and it's said of that these grapes are large. And so at first you'd think, well, that's great. Who doesn't like a large, juicy grape? And so it sounds like it would be another good reaping. But it turns out that we're going to see that it's not. So what it does line up with, and let me back up just a little bit. The first reaping of the harvest is followed immediately by this reaping. So they're essentially at the same time is what we take from that. And so we're looking for references in the Bible, in other books of the Bible that talk about two things being reaped. And we do find that. One of them is in Matthew 3:12, and this appears in other Gospels and places too. And so this says, for the winnowing fan is in his hand, and he purges his threshing floor. And that means that when you're done threshing the grain, and you thresh the grain by taking the grain heads and smashing them on the floor, and you would separate the chaff that goes around the seed of the grain that's in the wheat, and you would separate the two of them. And so this winnowing fan was used to separate the seeds that you did want from the other stuff, the chaff that you didn't want. And so it says, and he purges his threshing floor, and he gathers the wheat into his barns. Okay, that's the first rapture that we saw, or the rapture that we saw in Revelation. And the chaff he will burn in fire that is not extinguished. And so there's that fire again that we saw mentioned in the Revelation reference as well. So for this reason and others, other verses that are very similar, we see that this is that, it'd be bad to call it a rapture, it is dealing with the chaff. And that is that they're going to be burned in fire that is not extinguished. And we understand what that means. So we see those here. Both Matthew talks about both of them, and it's pretty clear that the grapes, therefore, are not good, juicy grapes like you would expect, but these are grapes that have something in them we don't want. And so what we see in the very next verses is more about those grapes. And it says, so in the first verses we saw, the angel was commanded to use his sharp sickle to reap the grapes. And here we see the reaping happening and the results of the reaping. And so in Revelation 14, 19 through 20 says, and the angel thrust his sickle on earth and gathered the vines of the earth and cast into the great winepress of the passion of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came out of the winepress until the bridle of the horses for 1,200 stadia. A stadia is the length of distance, about a city block in length. And so what we see here is the grapes are put in a wine press and stomped, which is a very normal thing. That's how you would do it. We didn't see anything equivalent with the wheat when it was harvested. In the Matthew reference, it just says it's harvested and stored in a barn. But here we see the grapes are put into a wine press and they're stomped, which you would normally do to get the value from the grapes. And it says it's outside the city, and this is an interesting reference because whenever we see outside the city, I've never seen a case when it wasn't referring to Jesus who was killed outside the city of Jerusalem. And so there's a tie-in here that these people are being killed outside the city of Jerusalem. And now these juicy grapes that we expected would be good for their content, instead of the juice, though, once they're trodden in the wine press, we get blood. And blood is significant to understand. Most Christians don't get the significance that a Jew would understand from this. Jews were specifically and repeatedly told not to eat blood. And it was, and they did most of their own animal butchering, and so they were familiar with the necessity of getting the blood out of the animal and making sure the animal meat was kosher. And so they took great pains to make sure that they didn't get any blood in their diet. Blood was not consumable. It was a violation to even eat blood. And as Christians who shop at the nearest grocery store, we don't have that same connection to blood that they did. And so they would understand it more significantly than we do. But what we do see is lots of it, lots of blood coming out of these. And it says the blood comes up to the bridle of a horse. Now, the bridle of the horse is kind of the high neck of the horse. That's where the bridle is. And this is blood to the bridle is likely an idiomatic phrase, which means it has a meaning to it that you can't discern directly from the words. And so blood up to the bridle probably means nothing more than an immense amount of blood, an unbelievable amount of blood. If you had blood up to the bridle of a horse, you've been in a serious battle. And so that's the reference there. And we also see that 1,200 stadia, which would be 118 miles in our units. It's not at all clear what that is. I don't know of anybody who has a full understanding of that. I have what I think is the correct understanding, but I'm not going to go into that now or the reasons for it or anything like that. But I believe it does make sense for a good reason. So what all is going on here? We saw that Jesus talked about this event, and we'll go to that Matthew verse again, and it says, "For the winnowing fan is in his hand, and he purges his threshing floor, and he gathers the wheat into his barns, and the chaff he will burn in fire that is not extinguished." So the wheat have been gathered by the time we read this verse in Revelation, and now Revelation is talking about this new event. And this new event correlates with other places. We saw first that Matthew 3 talks about both of these things happening, the collecting of the wheat and putting them in the barn and burning of the chaff. And we saw how that lined up with what Revelation says. And now we see another place in Revelation where it talks about this same idea of the chaff being burned in fire. And that comes from Revelation 19:20. And it says, "And the beast was captured, and the false prophet with it, who did signs before it, by which he seduced those who received the mark of the beast, and those who worshipped its image, and both went down and were cast into the lake of fire that burns also with brimstone." And so we see another reference here to a literal event that is going to happen, and it matches with what we're seeing here about the chaff that is going to be burned and thrown into the fire. And so this, the beast being captured and all of this happens, and being thrown into the lake of fire, more importantly, happens when Jesus comes. It isn't part of the great white throne judgment. It is part of that immediate judgment that happens when Jesus returns. And that lines up with what we saw elsewhere. And so it is talked about in other places too, but the beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire immediately. They don't wait for the great fire or the great white throne judgment. And we understand that the beast is not a person. The beast is really an organization with a leader who is a person. And so when it talks about the beast being captured, it means more than that. It means all of the people who are the beast people. And so these would be the people in the beast's army, the people in the beast's organizational structure. It would be all of those people who had sworn allegiance to the beast and taken the mark and all of that stuff that was associated with becoming part of the beast's people. So these aren't regular people. These are organizational people for the beast. And so all of those people and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire immediately on Jesus' return. And so everything here that we see is lining up very well with what Jesus says in Matthew, where he talks about at the same time the wheat is put into the barns, the chaff will be burned up and thrown into fire. And so in Revelation, just as we did in the previous study about the Revelation and where the rapture appears in it, we see verses that come ahead of this that support this idea that it's the people who worship the beast and his image and received his mark that are the ones who are being burned in fire early. And so this part comes from Revelation 14:6-11, and it says, Another, the third angel, followed them, saying with a great voice, Whoever worshipped the beast and its image and received its mark on his forehead shall also drink from the wine of the passion of the Lord Yahweh, which is mixed without dilution in the cup of his rage, and he will be tormented by fire and brimstone before the holy angels and before the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascends for the eternity of eternities, and there is no rest, day or night, for those who worship the beast and its image, and for him who takes the mark of its name. So there's a number of things I want to point out here. Clearly it says, whoever worshiped the beast and its image and received its mark on his forehead. So these will be the beast's own personal people, his organizational people. And we also see will be tormented by fire and brimstone, and that lines up with what we've been talking about, the chaff being burned in fire. So that's, we expected that as well. It also says, more interestingly, there is no rest for these people. And what we did see in Revelation for the people who of the wheat who were reaped is that they would rest for eternity. And so here we see there is no rest, day or night, for those who worship the beast, and that is ongoing.